Imagine a man who has sex almost every day, and yet he feels almost no pleasure. In shame, the problem isn't a lack of sex. The problem is that his brain no longer seems capable of experiencing reward. And even stranger, what keeps him trapped in this cycle may not be desire at all. It may be shame. So, how can shame push the brain into a loop of addiction, isolation, and emotional numbness? At first glance, Brandon's life looks almost functional. He has a good job, a clean apartment, a routine. But the film quietly reveals something unsettling. Brandon has sex almost every day, and yet he never seems to enjoy it. No excitement, no connection, just repetition. So, the real question isn't why he seeks sex. The real question is why it never feels like pleasure. From a neuroscience perspective, Brandon's behavior resembles something closer to behavioral addiction. In addiction, the brain's dopamine system begins to change. The brain slowly shifts from enjoying pleasure to chasing it. Because dopamine is not really the molecule of pleasure, it is the molecule of anticipation and pursuit. With repeated stimulation, the reward system gradually loses sensitivity. Over time, this can lead to something psychiatry calls anhedonia, a reduced ability to feel pleasure, which may explain why Brandon, even in moments that should feel intensely pleasurable, seems to feel almost nothing at all. Addiction rarely begins with pleasure, more often it begins with relief. A trigger activates memory and emotion, and the brain starts searching for three things it is wired to crave: reward, relief, and novelty. Dopamine rises not to create joy, but to signal that something important might happen, something rewarding, something that might reduce discomfort, or something new. Novelty matters because the dopamine system is highly sensitive to new stimuli, the unfamiliar, the unpredictable, the next variation. And over time, the brain begins to chase that novelty. But repetition changes the system. Prefrontal control weakens, stress circuits grow stronger, and the behavior slowly shifts from seeking pleasure to escaping pain. And then comes shame. Not I did something wrong, but there is something wrong with me. Shame activates stress again, and the brain returns to the only pattern it knows that can silence the tension: relief, reward, novelty. Isolation. One of the most striking things about shame is how quiet it is. Long stretches pass with almost no dialogue, just Brandon alone, in his apartment, on the subway, moving through the city like a ghost. This silence is not just stylistic, it mirrors something happening inside the brain. When we are alone and not focused on the outside world, a network called the default mode network becomes active. This network is involved in self-reflection, in replaying memories, in constructing the story we tell ourselves about who we are. In healthy amounts, this inner narrative helps us make sense of our lives. But when the default mode network becomes overactive, the mind can turn inward in a darker way. Self-reflection becomes self-criticism, thought becomes rumination, and emotions like shame grow louder. The more a person becomes trapped in this internal narrative, the more they withdraw from others. Isolation deepens the loop, and in that state, addictive behaviors can begin to serve a very specific purpose: not to create pleasure, but to briefly silence the mind. What is shame? Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, there is something wrong with me. This film is not about guilt. Brandon never breaks down over what he's done. He breaks down over what he is. Watch him closely. He doesn't look like someone chasing pleasure. He looks like someone trying to outrun himself. Shame is not an emotion like sadness or anger. Neurologically, it's a threat state. Brain imaging shows activation in the amygdala, the insula, and the anterior cingulate cortex, the same regions that fire when the body senses physical danger. The brain goes into survival mode, and in survival mode, the brain doesn't search for meaning or connection, it searches for relief. Addictive behavior becomes a psychological anesthetic. It doesn't heal the wound, it numbs it. But when the anesthetic wears off, the wound is still there. The shame addiction spiral. Here is what makes addiction almost elegant in its cruelty. Every repetition makes the person worse, not better, worse. There's a brief window of relief, then a deeper emptiness, then the shame returns, heavier than before, and that shame becomes the trigger for the next cycle. Shame drives the behavior. The behavior generates more shame. The spiral tightens, but this loop doesn't exist in isolation. It's reinforced by a deeper architecture: unresolved trauma, disrupted attachment, chronic emotional deprivation. The behavior is not the problem, it's the solution to a problem that was never addressed. Why intimacy is hard for him. There's a scene where Brandon has dinner with Marianne. It's awkward, it's honest. Something real passes between them, and then he shuts down. Later, with someone he doesn't know, someone he'll never see again, he has no problem. This is the paradox of avoidant attachment. Physical intimacy without emotional exposure feels safe. Real intimacy, the kind where someone actually sees you, feels like a threat. Because for Brandon, being truly seen means being truly known. And shame turns that into exposure. Casual sex maintains the distance. Real connection collapses it. And when the distance collapses, so does he. Layers of shame. Shame in this film doesn't operate on a single level. There's sexual shame, the conflict between desire and disgust, hating yourself for wanting what you want. There's relational shame, the fear of being emotionally exposed to another person. Marianne threatens this. Sissy threatens it more. She doesn't keep her distance. She calls. She shows up. She stays. Her vulnerability is destabilizing to him, not because he doesn't care, but because she threatens the walls he spent years building. And beneath all of it, existential shame. Not, I did something wrong, but a quiet, persistent sense that something about you is fundamentally flawed. This is where shame stops being a feeling and starts shaping identity. The self becomes painful to inhabit, and addictive behavior becomes not just relief, but the only way to briefly leave that self behind. What the film is really about. Shame is not a film about excess. It's a film about emptiness, about loneliness so deep it becomes structural. Brandon is not chasing pleasure. He's trying to outrun his own mind. That glance on the subway, it's not just attraction. It's a silent promise of something new. Novelty is a dopamine activating stimulus. The brain imagines possibility, connection, excitement, relief. But novelty fades. It always fades. And when it does, unresolved shame resets the cycle. The spiral continues until shame is recognized, understood, and maybe no longer survived alone.